Hello everyone, it's 1 p.m. Eastern, and that means it's time to begin another of our monthly CoCoRaHS Weather Talk webinars. Thanks for joining us today. I'm your host, Henry Regis, and as usual, running the technical side of our program is our very own Noah Newman. We're coming to you live from the Colorado Climate Center here at Colorado State University in sunny Fort Collins, Colorado. Our broadcasts are recorded and archived for future viewing on our website. So if you have somebody out there that's missed this one, they'll be able to watch it via YouTube. All of our Weather Talk webinars are sponsored by generous donations from listeners just like you. Well, today we're going to talk about phenology. You're probably asking yourself, what is this I've signed up for? Now, not to worry, folks. Our guests will answer questions like, are plants really responsive to environmental conditions? We'll take a look at why the timing of rainfall and heat events affect when plants leaf out, flowers open, fruits ripen, birds migrate, insects hatch, and a whole lot more. Everything you wanted to know. Well, most of that we'll talk about today. And with us today is a longtime friend and supporter of CoCoRaHS, Teresa Crimmins. Teresa serves as the Assistant Director for the USA National Phenology Network's National Coordinating Office in Tucson, Arizona. She's been with NPN since 2007. Teresa holds degrees from Western Michigan University and the University of Arizona. Her research interests encompass plant response to global change, spatial analysis, and engaging citizen science of all ages, citizen scientists, there we go, of all ages in scientific discovery. Little known fact is that Teresa's a fan of good coffee, black licorice, hot peppers, IPAs, and cheese. And oh yeah, she also likes talking about phenology. Well, Teresa, welcome. It's great to have you with us on our broadcast today.
Thank you, Henry. That was such a lovely introduction. And I'm really excited to be here.
Well, it's great to have, and Teresa's an old friend of ours, so it's always great to have folks we know helping us out here. Hey, I've got a quick question for you. One that comes up, isn't phenology kind of like the study of bumps on your head? Is it? Maybe you can give us a quick definition or a sentence, word or two on what phenology is for those taking notes at home.
I definitely can do that. Thanks, Henry. I do get that question a lot, and I think phrenology is actually a more well-understood concept than the term phenology, even though we've been making it our focus for the last 10 years to change that trend in the public here within our country. Phrenology is that old-fashioned study of the lumps on your head to see if you have a criminal tendency. Phenology is actually the study of life cycle events in plants and animals, and it's actually when they happen. So when do the trees that are in your yard put on their leaves, or when are they changing color? When do birds migrate or insects hatch, as you mentioned earlier? There's a whole wide range of these kinds of events, and you may notice that the timing of these events varies from year to year, even in the same location. And so we've made it our business here at the USA National Phenology Network to raise awareness around that and to better document what's going on there. And the focus of this presentation will be all about why the heck we would bother to care about that. So, in short, our outreach folks here love to say that phenology is nature's calendar. And it really is. There's tons of documentation of different cultures for many millennia, really, keeping track of when things happen and tying that, using that really as a calendar, tying it to things like phases of the moon, rather than an actual paper calendar. And so before things started changing, cultures were able to use that to help keep track of where they were in the year and what they might expect to happen next. So we actually define phenology. We kind of break it down by species, which is an individual plant or animal, and then keep track of individual events or phases that they undergo over the course of a year. And in plants, generally this happens, the phenophases that we track pertain to the leaf status. So when are leaf buds appearing or opening? When are the leaves elongating, reaching their full length, changing color and falling off? When do we see similar activity in flowers? When are we beginning to see the buds? When are we seeing those flower buds open? When are we seeing them wilt and fall off? And probably many of you are aware that when you have flowers, if they get pollinated, they tend to lead to the development of fruits. And so those two things generally are tied, but when do we see fruits beginning to develop? When do we identify them as ripe? And when are they no longer viable? When are they beginning to rot and fall off? For animals, depending on the species, it can be a bit trickier. People always often like to ask me, do humans have phenology? And that's tricky because we don't really undergo fluctuations over the course of a year that are predictable. But a lot of other animal species do, where they enter into estrus or being able to reproduce only at a certain time of year, and they phase in and out of that over the course of the year. We keep track of, and it really varies depending on the species, but we keep track of when they are mating, when they're rearing young, when those young fledge or move on to being independent. And so it has to do with those different activities that can be identified as recurring over the course of a year with some predictability. So what drives phenology? Just like any good scientist, my answer is going to be, well, it depends. We never want to give anybody a straight answer. It depends on what species we're talking about, whether it's a plant or an animal, but even within taxonomic groups, even within closely related species, it can really vary. It depends on the season. Are we talking about springtime events or autumn phenophases? Are we talking about in the Colorado Rockies, where our CoCoRaHS team is, or are we talking about down here in Tucson, where I am, which is a totally different system, or in the Midwest or Northeast? And of course, it depends on the phenophase. Are we talking about bud burst for leaves, or are we talking about leaf color change? That said, getting all that out of the way, there are some very clear patterns. A lot of species, if I can really generalize here, and I'm going to talk about the easiest stuff first. The stuff that happens in the temperate system, which is most of our country, so ignoring all the desert areas where ecosystems are water limited. If we look at places where generally things are temperature limited and you go through the nice 4 seasons, generally in the springtime, those, and if we talk about plants, generally temperature really matters. And I imagine if you've paid much attention to what's happened in your yard, if you live in one of those temperature limited systems, you're pretty aware that if you have an early spring, meaning warm temperatures earlier than normal, you tend to see at least some of the plants in your yard respond accordingly, and they'll begin to put out shoots or little leaf buds early on, earlier than normal also. However, again, depending on if you're in an area where moisture matters, like where I live, then rainfall has much more of an influence than temperature tends to. For the most part here, we aren't limited by temperature. It's warm enough almost all year round for plants to do whatever they need to do, but they need to wait around for the right amount of moisture before they can start actually putting on some new growth or flowers. And also, it really does vary. When you start digging into it, even within a species, across its range, what variables drive it can vary. In the northern part of the range, frost events or sensitivity to cold temperatures and the subsequent warming after cold may have much greater influence than in the southern part of its range. I know a researcher has looked at the range of red maple, which is much of the eastern US, and in the northern part of the range, the red maple trees need to pay attention to spring temperature warming much more in the north than in the south. So it's complicated, really. However, again, going back to generalizing, in a lot of plants, again, in those systems where it's mainly temperature that limits things, so much of our country, it is temperature. And so to kind of have a short and simple story, I'm going to focus on the temperature right now. And for a small number of species, primarily agricultural species, researchers have pinned down explicitly how much warming it actually takes to push those plants from one phase to the next. And so this is a growth model that was published by the folks at the University of Minnesota for spring barley. And you don't really need to concern yourself with all the details on the bottom, but basically what they're showing there is if you are to keep track of how much warmth is accumulated following a start date, and in this case we can just call that the first of the year, January 1st, as it gets warmer, as you accumulate warmth, so for each day that it's warm, you're saying add that to the previous day, So as we continue to achieve warmer and warmer temperatures, the plants progress through those phases. However, if you have a warm spring, but then it kind of it levels off and it stays at that same temperature for a while, you might run through the first couple of phases quickly, but then sit still for a while before achieving the next phenophase, and that's basically because it hasn't reached that sufficient warming to kick over to the next place. And so this is pretty widely used in the agricultural realm to best understand when to optimize timing for planting and harvesting and those kinds of events that require intervention. So in a lot of species, we don't know super well what the conditions are, but one of the ways that we can begin to try and tease that apart is by just looking at observational data where people have kept track of what's happening and then tying it to observations of things like temperature. And so here are some observations. I don't actually know where these were collected. I think somewhere in the eastern US. But some researchers looked at when were red-eyed vireos arriving. These are migratory species, so they're coming up in the spring, and they tracked at that same location over from 2004 through 2010. When did the birds arrive? And so the purple line, or I'm sorry, the green line represents the arrival date. And so you can look to see in 2004 it arrived on day about let's see, that would be 107. That would be about early March. And you can see that the temperature, which is on the right axis over here, was somewhere in this is probably average temperature, maybe average minimum temperature, I'm not sure, was somewhere in the realm of 3 degrees. And then in the next year, it was actually much later, so this axis is reversed. So it was day 114 where they saw it in the next year, and the temperature was lower. And then you continue to see that relationship play out. And so scientists can then look at those relationships and try to get begin to get a sense for whether a particular variable actually does seem to be associated with phenology. And so in this case, it does look like the red-eyed vireo migration is tied to temperature in some way. One point that I wanted to make here, though, is that as those environmental conditions, like those minimum temperatures, vary from year to year, so does the timing of the phenology, and that's because those things are fairly tightly tied in a lot of cases. In addition to that year-to-year fluctuation that we see in the timing of the environmental variables and subsequently in the phenology, we also, as you probably are aware, are dealing with underlying trend in environmental variables, and the most prominent of those is temperature. So I stole this graph here from the most recent National Climate Assessment, and what the map is showing is the trend or the change in average temperature from the last couple of decades compared to the first half of the century. So I think what they did was average those annual temperatures for the last 20 years and then difference it from those for the first 60 years in the century. And then where you see the strongest reds, you see the biggest changes, the biggest increases in average temperature. And then the lighter blues are where temperatures have actually decreased. And what you see is that in most of the country, we're seeing a fairly significant trend. And then the bar graphs support that on a regional perspective. You don't need to go into great detail on the regional trends here. Basically, what I wanted to communicate is that it's pretty clearly documented that there has been pretty strong trends in increasing temperatures in much of the country in the past 100 years. Whoops, that was supposed to be animated. Oh well, probably many of you are aware too that as a function of those changes in temperatures, we have seen changes in things like our hardiness zones. And so the hardiness zones are the zones in which plants are recommended for optimum growing conditions. And so if you ever look on the back of your seed packets, you can look and see, is a particular plant that you want to plant well suited for where you live or maybe not so well, or if you want to try and pull it off, when should you plant it? And so where I live, I end up planting stuff now that you guys might not plant until, say, April, and that's just because of the temperature conditions are so different in southern Arizona than they are in, say, Michigan. With the big increases that we've seen in temperature in just the past couple of decades, the USDA has actually had to change those hardiness zones. And the map that's on the top here is showing you how much of a change those hardiness zones have have been adapted just from the 1990s to 2015. So just over the course of 25 years, there were huge shifts in some of those zones. The banding here that you're seeing on that is when one zone used to be there and then its border shifted northward. That's not clear on the map, but it's basically you went up. And so as a consequence, we're seeing a whole lot of things like this where, and I know you guys are all weather folks, so I'm sure I had to steal something from the Weather Channel. This is a graphic that's becoming a much more common occurrence anymore, where we just are reporting above normal temperatures across huge swaths of the continent. And then as a function of that, seeing weird things like the cherry blossoms coming out down in DC, you know, in February instead of April, and everybody out lying on the mall and enjoying the warm temperatures. But it's definitely out of line from what it used to be like even 50 years ago. So with that underlying trend in temperature, the phenology of plants and animals is changing. How do we know this? One of the best ways we can identify and document how things have changed is to look at records that folks collected in previous decades. And some of the best of those have been collected by some of the most prominent figures in ecology and the environment. One of those was Aldo Leopold. You may recognize that name because he wrote the Sand County Almanac, and in that he proposed his land ethic. And it was a pretty big deal for the time back in the 1940s in terms of helping folks recognize that maybe just shooting birds for fun isn't the best way to manage our natural environment. But in addition to thinking about how to manage ecosystems, he also kept really close track of when he saw things like birds arriving in the spring at his cabin, and when he saw the first flower or the first leaves on a whole bunch of different plant species there. And it became something that his family carried forward. This woman on the top right, Nina, is his daughter, and she kept records. She carried on the family tradition of collecting records on those kinds of things. And then in the 1990s, recognized that maybe there would be some benefit to trying to look for any sort of patterns or trends in those observations, because she knew that they had been good, rigorous observations, that she knew that who collected the data. She knew she could trust her family as identifying the species correctly, collecting good, solid records, and so they would be appropriate for being submitted to analytical techniques. And the crazy story was that she documented very clear trends, statistically significant trends, but then had a really hard time publishing the paper because back in the late 1990s, people just weren't that interested, journals weren't that interested in telling the story of how plants and animals are responding to climate change, because the words climate change just weren't widely accepted back then. But she persisted and eventually was able to get it accepted to the journal PNAS, which stands for the Proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences, which is a very, very high-profile, prominent journal. And it is one of the earliest and best documentations that we have of how, indeed, plants and animals and the timing of their phenology in the spring is changing. And so that's actually was a very important event in the history of phenology, recent history. Another great example is Henry David Thoreau, who is the guy that lived at Walden Pond in his little cabin there and wrote Walden and several other books, and was the conscientious objector and that sort of thing. He didn't really necessarily intend, I think, to be an ecologist and to go about and collect records that would be so very important for scientists in our era to be able to understand how things have changed. But it turns out that the meticulous records that he collected back in the 1850s have proven to be a very valuable source for which to compare how things are happening now. Excuse me. So a couple of our colleagues, Richard Premack and Abe Miller-Rushing at Boston University, discovered his journals and took it upon themselves to take all of his messy handwriting and try to turn it into actual records. And then they went out and resampled the exact same plants at the exact same location by walking around Walden Pond in the exact same areas that he did in the early 2000s. And then, really cool, they also discovered that another gentleman by the name of Alfred Hosmer had done the same thing right around the turn of the century with many of the same species. And so they were able to digitize Thoreau's and Hosmer's records, then collect records of their own for the same exact species, and then look at when did they first report, when did all three researchers document the first flowering date for a wide range of species. And so what this graph here shows is the year along the x-axis and then the day of year on the y-axis. And in general, Thoreau saw things happen in early May for a suite of, I don't know, 20 or 30 plant species. On average, Hosmer started to see it just a little bit earlier, and then Abe and Richard saw it weeks earlier. In fact, on average, it depends on the species, it was somewhere between, on average, 7 to 12 days earlier since the 1850s. And for some species, it was actually several weeks earlier. In addition, not only did they see a lot of the species show advancement in their phenology, they saw that not all of the species advanced at the same rate. Some species didn't change at all. Some changed a lot, and some changed a little. So back in Thoreau's time, on average, they saw birds arrive on about May 6th. They saw leaf out for several of the, I think that's a viburnum, on May 10th, and then May 15th for some little blue flower. When they resampled just a few years ago, they saw that all of those same species' phenology had advanced to before any of them. The latest of the three in 2010, or the 2010s, whatever we call that decade, was May 3rd. And in addition, the order has now changed, where the birds are arriving sooner than the little blue flowers, and the viburnum is leafing out before the birds. And that may not seem like a very big deal, but it actually can have major implications for food availability or shelter for different species that are relying upon things to happen at certain times. And that can then have ripple implications for population sizes and community structure and function, actually. One really classic example of that is the English oak winter moth pied flycatcher tritrophic interaction that was documented about 10 years ago in Europe. What's happening there is the English oak leaves out in the spring in somewhere in Europe. I don't remember exactly where. The winter moth is a little obligate species which has to eat on that guy, and it leaves out, or I'm sorry, those eggs hatch at about the same time that the English oak does, and then they can feed on the English oak leaves as a food source. Then the pied flycatcher is a migratory species that spends its winters down in northern Africa, I think, and then it comes north as it becomes spring, and it needs to feed on the winter moths. Well, what has happened in just recent years is that the leaf out for the English oak is happening earlier as a function of warmer temperatures, and following along with that, the winter moth is hatching earlier. Both of those species seem to be pretty well tied to spring temperatures, and they're both advancing their phenology at about the same rate. However, the poor little pied flycatcher is cued to migrate north based on sun angle, which means where is the sun in the sky. And that is a function of where the Earth is around the sun as it's making its revolution over the course of a year. So it doesn't matter how warm our planet gets, that part doesn't change. The Earth is still going around the sun at the exact same rate, and so the sun angle is constant from year to year. And so that poor little pied flycatcher is migrating at the same time every year. And when they're arriving to their breeding grounds where these guys need to feed on little winter moths, the winter moths have already moved on to their next life cycle stage, and a lot of them are in their pupas and are no longer available as a food source for the pied flycatcher. As a consequence, we are seeing huge declines in the population of the pied flycatchers. In some places, they documented up to a 90% decline in the population. And so that's one example of a major change that we've seen as a function of warming temperatures. So, shifting gears, because scientists began to document these kinds of changes, leveraging historical records and even just some current observations like the pied flycatcher example, the US national government recognized that maybe we should keep better track of this kind of stuff. Maybe we should establish a network to, in a rigorous fashion, document what we're seeing in terms of phenology so that we can better understand how species are changing, how phenology is changing in individual species, and then what the implications are of those kinds of changes. If we begin to see changes in population sizes for different plants or animals, could that have influence on things like agricultural food sources that we depend on, or the availability of plants that we need for medications? And so our network was established. The USA National Phenology Network is funded primarily by the U.S. Geological Survey, and we have a staff of about 12 that sit here in Tucson. Most of us are University of Arizona employees. Just one of us is a USGS employee. And what our staff does is basically support this entity. And what the NPN exists to do is basically serve as a repository for phenology data and information. We make it our business to help collect, store, and share phenology data and data products. And we do that to support science, so that basic understanding of what phenology is and how it's changing, to better inform decisions of all different flavors across a wide range of sectors, and then also to communicate with the public so that folks know what phenology is and not confuse it with phrenology, among other things. So one of the big things that we do is run a program called Nature's Notebook. And that is our citizen science program, if you want to call it that. It's kind of similar to CoCoRaHS in that we engage volunteers across the whole US to collect observations on the timing of life cycle events, or phenology, in plants and animals. Right now, if you're interested in participating, and we have thousands of people that do, but not anywhere near the CoCoRaHS numbers, you can make observations and report them through our system on about 1,000 different taxa of plant and animals, following rigorous standardized protocols. And why we have such rigorous protocols is that we really want to yield data that can be used by scientists and decision makers. And in that way, we actually are fairly parallel to CoCoRaHS. Since we were established, since the Nature's Notebook program was launched in 2009, we've amassed over 8.5 million records of phenology at over 8,600 sites across the US. And those data are now being used not only by decision makers in a broad range of sectors, but also by scientists. And I've lost count now, but we're somewhere around, we have had at least 30 peer-reviewed publications that have used some of our data in one way or another. And I have to brag, because we always have an annual goal of collecting some data. Our goal for 2016 was to collect 2 million records, and we just crossed that threshold this morning. So if you go to our website, you'll see this icon on there that we reached 100% of our goal today. So I'm very, very proud of all of our participants. This is kind of a dated map, but just in case you're interested in knowing where the data are coming from, this is a map that I made that shows the volume of records that have been reported at the different sites. So we definitely have some hot spots where we've got lots of data being collected, and some parts of the country that are really underrepresented. So we're working on trying to fill some of those out. How it works is that there are standardized protocols for any one of the species that you observe. Basically what that means is that depending on the species, you're faced with a series of questions to answer each time you go to make an observation. So for this example, someone is observing sandhill crane. So every time they go to their location where they're observing, they are faced with these questions of, do you see or hear active individuals? And they would answer yes, no, or I'm not sure. Do you see or hear feeding? Yes or no, calls or song, nest building, so on. And how the protocols work is that each of those things is defined fairly specifically, so that hopefully if you're the one making the observation, you can answer with fairly good confidence as to whether that's a yes or a no. But if you're still not sure, you can always answer the question mark as I'm just not sure. And we encourage that rather than forcing an answer that you're not confident in. You can participate by filling out your observations on paper data sheets and then sitting down at your computer and entering those in. Or we have apps that work on phones and tablets, and they work regardless of if you're within Wi-Fi range or cell signal to collect your data. And then I won't go into great detail, but we have loads of resources for helping you get up to speed on what you're doing, or if you're interested in teaching a class or working with a group, our outreach group is amazing in terms of their support and resources that they have available for folks getting started or wanting to sustain activity. Then what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about is some of the ways in which the data have been used, because I find this really interesting. As this slide shows on the left side, a lot of the uses of our data are in those peer-reviewed publications, and these screen caps show a couple of the more recent high-profile articles that have used our data. And then on the right side, our phenology data have also been used in the US National Climate Assessment, as well as the EPA indicators, climate change indicators too. So they are both leveraging data and resources that we make available here to be able to document how things are changing, which is good because that's one of the reasons why we exist. Then, kind of breaking it down to some of the more pragmatic uses, here are a couple more examples of how our phenology data are used. One of the ways that phenology data can be useful is to influence the timing of activities like planting and harvesting. If you know when to anticipate those events for a particular species, then you can plan when you should be out at different fields undertaking those activities. It can also be used for issuing allergy alerts or to do things like stock drugstores with a bunch of Claritin when it looks like allergies are going to hit. And we've been working over the years with a number of different groups, most recently the Council of Epidemiologists across the country, to better document pollen spread and release on a seasonal basis, because that is definitely a phenological event, and the timing of major pollen releases is tightly tied to temperature and other environmental conditions, and so can be predicted if you're collecting data regionally and regularly. A third way that phenology data can be used is in the treatment of invasive species, and I have a good example of that in a little bit later, but trying to better maximize our understanding of when problematic species undergo different life cycle events. One thing that researchers have documented is that in many systems, species that have become really invasive have been able to do so because their phenology is offset from the native species phenology. And so in many cases, they will green up just a little bit earlier in the year than the native ones, which enables them to make use of resources like sunlight and soil resources quicker and more effectively than those native species, and therefore are able to outcompete them. If we know that, though, for a particular system, then we can better predict when those invasive species are going to green up and get out there and try and treat them quicker before the native species are susceptible. One thing I will mention is that all of the data, all 8.6 million records that we have right now in our database, are freely and readily available online. We have a data download tool where you or anybody can go and specifically query whatever you want and pull it down as a text file or Excel file for manipulation at your will. Or we also have a whole wide range of interactive online tools too, where you can look at patterns in species in terms of when they're undergoing their phenology at a particular location. That's what this top graph is showing, is that at somebody's particular location that they called home, they were looking at when did they see leaf out, flowering, and open flowers in forsythia, comparing 2013 and 2014. And you're definitely able to see that everything happened earlier by a couple of weeks, looks like, in 2013 than in 2014 at that particular location. You can also look at where species are being observed and the density of the data by species in the online visualization tool. And you can begin to plot across sites, are there relationships between when events are happening, like leaf out or flowering, and the temperature or precipitation at those locations. I won't go into a ton of detail, but if you're interested, I'm happy to answer follow-up questions, or we have full webinars just on how to use the visualization tool. It enables you to interact with the data quite a bit and evaluate patterns across sites and through time and across species without ever having to actually touch the data, which is actually kind of nice. So now what I'm going to do is just walk through some of the examples of what folks have come away with by using Nature's Notebook. Most of these examples are how researchers have used the data, but we also have some management questions too, which I find really interesting. So one of the examples that was published in Biogeosciences in 2015 was a group of researchers at Yale looked at leaf out. It was leaf data for a bunch of different overstory canopy trees, as well as they also leveraged data from satellites. And I think in this case, if you're familiar with satellites, I think it was MODIS data. What they do there is they can look at the different streams of data that come from the satellite and pin down when the trees began to leaf out. And so they corroborated that leaf out date using the reports of phenology from on the ground that were collected through Nature's Notebook. And what they did was look through years from 1982 through 2012, and they can't go back further in time because we don't have satellite data prior to that. And they were able to see, did the timing of when green out occurred and when those plants had little leaves start to show change at all over the course of those 30 years. I always have trouble with math when it crosses the century. That's 30 years. And what they saw was that depending on the part of the country, there were some really strong trends. Looking at the bottom here, the blue colors indicate that it was earlier. It's becoming earlier. And if it's a reddish or orange color, that indicates that it's becoming later. And they saw a very strong trend for earlier leaf out or bud burst occurring in the Midwest over that time period. And then interestingly, some delays along the West Coast and even in the UP of Michigan. And then on the tail end of the season, they looked at when did senescence occur? Basically, when did green leaves change color and cease to produce chlorophyll, which is what causes the leaf color change that many of you are probably seeing right now. And in that same portion of the country, the Midwest, where the advancement in spring was occurring, they saw no change in the timing of fall or senescence. But then we saw a trend toward later senescence in many other parts of the country, like the Northwest, the Rockies, where our CoCoRaHS team is, and then some of the Northwest too. So even though the portions of the season, the timing of the season that are changing here depends on where you are, basically almost everywhere across the continental United States, we are seeing a trend toward a longer growing season over that 30-year period. And shifting gears to another study, there were a group of researchers that looked to see what matters in terms of when woody plants in particular put their leaves out in the spring. In general, it's pretty well documented and pretty well understood that that plants in general in the temperate systems require some amount of warming temperatures to prompt them to do whatever needs to happen hormonally within their cells to say, okay, start growing leaves and start bursting those leaf buds. It's time, it's safe, warm it up. What these guys found was, well, okay, we are trending toward having warmer springs earlier in the season, but so what's the implication of that? Are we seeing a advancement in the timing of leaf out? And in many species we are seeing that, and it's a pretty clear pattern, and it seems fairly straightforward. But in certain groups of plants, and in some of these woody plants in particular, they were seeing either an opposite trend or a much diminished trend, and they were trying to understand why. And what they were able to ascertain was that actually, if we have warmer winters, if it's warm enough, that actually works against the plant and causes it to have later bud burst, because the plants, as I understand it anyway, are trying to make sure they need to have sufficient chill first. And then after a sufficient amount of chill, then they start looking for it to be warmer. And then they know, okay, we got past the cold part of the season, now it's warming up, now it's safe, I shouldn't have to risk my buds freezing. If I put my buds on now, it's okay. But if the winter is warm enough that they don't receive that sufficient chill, then as it gets warmer and warmer and the season progresses, and it is time for them to leaf out, they're still waiting around for that chill. They're not paying attention to the warmth yet. And so they kind of get all confused. They're waiting and waiting and waiting for the chill, and in the meantime it's getting warmer and warmer and warmer, and eventually they do put on their leaves, although it's a much it's just much later in the season and has this consequence of kind of goofing everything all up. And so what the main take-home point from this study was is if we keep having warmer winters, and if it gets warm to the point where the plants aren't receiving their sufficient chill, then who knows what's going to happen? They don't even know. Like, bud bursts might continue to occur later and later in these particular species, which would definitely mess things up in terms of the order of events and who undergoes what at what time of year. Sticking with that message of winter temperatures matter, a group of researchers out of the University of California, Santa Barbara, looked at the phenology of some plants there in California. And California is an interesting ecosystem because that is one that's generally water limited. Much of California is considered to have a Mediterranean climate, which means that it's warm a lot of times and that you have some of that coastal influence depending on where you are. And that moisture, in a lot of cases, is the limiting variable. And so they collected data for a whole bunch of species and ended up focusing on these 4 in this particular evaluation across an area and across an elevation gradient, and tried to see what were the important driving variables in the timing of leaf out, flowering, and fruiting in these plants. And what they found was, interestingly, but consistent with the previous study, that if they had warm winters, if they had warm winter temperatures, then it resulted in delayed phenology in these species. And it wasn't just as simple of a story as the leaves came on later. It depended on the species. In some species, the leaves came on later. In others, the flowers or the fruits were delayed later in the season. And the other main point that they had, which was not really that surprising given that they're in the Mediterranean climate, was that precipitation does matter here. Looking forward, so the last few studies I just shared with you were examples of where researchers used data that we have collected to try to tell a story about what's been happening. Another thing that researchers can do is once you've got a particular story or a relationship established, then you can try and predict what's going to happen in the future. And one way that a lot of scientists do this is leverage climate change models. So there are a whole bunch of different models on what the climate might be expected to do in the future, depending on whether we cut down on our carbon emissions or if we keep on going with the rate of carbon emission that we have going on. It doesn't matter which scenario you look at, they all kind of look scary. But what people who study phenology can do is superimpose the plant or animal phenological response on top of those scenarios to see how are things going to change. In this particular study, some researchers out of Cornell looked to see what's going to happen in terms of leaf out and the coincidence with frosts. This was triggered because some of you may remember 2012 was the earliest spring that we've ever had on record, and much of the Midwest was hit really hard by that, where it was warm super early, and then there were some major frosts that came after that, killing frosts. And in Michigan in particular, I know the apple crop was just decimated. It was like 90% of the apples the trees didn't bear fruit because the buds were killed in those killing frosts. And so these researchers looked at the conditions that occurred in 2012 and then looked at how conditions are expected to change in the coming 50 to 100 years to see, are those kinds of killing frosts and conditions, early springs and late frosts, expected to become more frequent. And unfortunately, yeah, they actually said, shoot, by mid-century, they predict, and this is even kind of conservative, that kind of killing frost, that set of conditions could occur once in every 3 years. And like I said, warm temperatures, early warm temperatures plus frosts is really bad news for crops. So this is an important finding that got some press a few weeks ago, trying to highlight that folks in the agricultural realm might want to be aware, because that's not that far in the future that we might be able to expect some pretty scary changes. So now shifting gears to even more management-y kind of stuff. I guess that last example was kind of management-y too. Some of the more on-the-ground kind of ways that phenology data can be used. This is an example that's very local to me. This is the Sonoran Desert, and we are characterized by columnar cacti like the saguaro that you see in those pictures, which are not fire adapted. This low desert ecosystem is definitely not fire adapted. If fire comes through, it kills those poor cacti. They actually explode, and that's not pretty. And those guys, you know, they're iconic, and they take 100 years to grow an arm, and so we try to avoid fire. Unfortunately, we've got a really nasty invasive grass coming in called bufflegrass, which was actually introduced about 100 and some years ago on purpose as cattle forage, and it has really been able to take hold, and in some cases you can see it just infills all of the spaces between the naturally growing shrubby and cactus vegetation. The reason why it's so nasty is that it puts on new biomass every year, and the biomass that from the previous years just keep accumulating, and it carries fire really well. And so when fire does get started, and that's a fairly common occurrence just by lightning during our monsoon season, or humans, because we have definitely the wildland urban interface here, the fire can spread, and it can get really hot, and it can definitely kill the cacti. So managers have identified that the best way to try to deal with bufflegrass is to spread it with herbicide, and their weapon of choice is Roundup, which is, if you're familiar with herbicides, that's a non-selective, meaning it kills anything it touches if it's green. The biomass needs to be green in order for it to be effective. So if they are treating the bufflegrass but the overspray, usually they do it by spraying by hand or from aerial, like airplanes, which is really gets it all over everything. Pretty much everything it touches, it would kill potentially. And so they saw an opportunity to try and pin down what is it that triggers the green up in bufflegrass, and can we differentiate a time frame where that would be that we could maximize hitting the green bufflegrass and minimize hitting anything else that's green. That's still a tricky question, but what researchers did was keep track of when they saw green bufflegrass and then what was happening in the in terms of environmental conditions. And researchers here, leveraging observations of bufflegrass that were collected by volunteers here in the Tucson Basin, saw a pretty tight relationship, may not surprise you, that when it rains, basically we see a pretty immediate green up in the bufflegrass. So what they've got is two different plots on top of each other. The blue line is the precipits through the year, through a couple of years, and then the green line is the percent of the canopy that was green. And what you see is generally when you have a reasonably large precipitation event, and I actually don't know the units here, that must be millimeters, that the plant greens up quickly. And so what they've been able to do is construct a little predictive model that says, if you have a precipitation event of such and such a size at your location, then get ready to get out there like within the next few days to go zap your bufflegrass, because it's going to be green, and it actually greens up quicker than the native vegetation. So take advantage of that if you can. One more example that I really like is folks in the Twin Cities area of Minnesota. What these guys recognized was when they have leaves fall, like they probably are having right now, if they aren't swept up in the suburban area, then they tend to wash down into the storm drains. And when a lot of leaf matter ends up in the storm drains, it is washed out into surface water bodies, like some of their nice inland or lakes and ponds there in the city, and that can lead to some major eutrophication, which is when nitrogen and phosphorus go way up and then the water body grows a bunch of yucky looking algae. It's not pretty and it's not good for the water quality either. What they recognized was if they knew when the leaves were falling in different neighborhoods, that they could use that to more effectively schedule their street sweepers to pick up those leaves and keep the leaves out of the waterway, therefore increasing or enhancing water quality. And so what they've been doing for the last couple of years there is engaging homeowners in the different neighborhoods in keeping track of when the leaves are falling, basically using Nature's Notebook to track the phenology of their different tree species, and then reporting that and using that to target different neighborhoods for the Department of Public Works uses that information to get their street sweepers out cleaning things up. Okay, it looks like I still have a few minutes, so I'm just going to go through this stuff quickly, but I thought this may be interesting to you too. It's kind of a departure from everything I've been talking about. But in addition to all of the observations that we collect and maintain and share on different species and their phenological events, another thing that we just daylighted this past year was we're now generating and producing and making available what we're calling phenology maps. And there's two suites of phenology maps that we're making available right now. One of these are based on accumulated growing degree days, which is again at a particular location how much heat is accumulated. For these maps, we use a start date of January 1st and then a couple of different base temperatures. Without going into a bunch of gory detail on that, basically what it means is how rapidly it's getting warm from the perspective of what would matter mainly to plants, because for the most part, growing degree day information is used in the plant world. However, pest managers do too. There are a lot of proponents of using growing degree days in the IPM, integrated pest management or world as well. So what we've got is daily maps for the entire continental US, and these are updated every day, that show you basically how much heat has been accumulated. And so this particular map is for May 29th of this particular year. And what the units are for any pixel on the map is the growing degree days. That's interesting, but what you might find even more interesting is the other thing that we produce, also on a daily basis, is the anomaly, which I realize, talking to this crowd, you might actually know what an anomaly is. I'm used to people not. But basically what that is how different is this from average conditions? And so this is May 10th. I should have made it the same day. But on May 10th of this past year, how were we doing in terms of how warm it has been since January compared to what normal conditions are called? And so what we find in that particular, on May 10th of this past year, in my neck of the woods in southern Arizona, we were way ahead of schedule. It was very warm here and in Southern California. Up in Michigan in the Northeast, you guys were actually kind of behind schedule. The gray means that you were right at average conditions on that day of year, and anything blue or green means that you were behind schedule or that it had been cooler than average, and everything orange or red means that it had been warmer than average. The interesting thing about these is that these update on a daily basis, and so even though we were way ahead of schedule by May, if we would have had it, if we would have shifted to having a bunch of cool weeks in a row, we could have actually dropped behind schedule by, say, June or July. So these are really kind of interesting maps for kind of gauging where you are at on any given day, actually. And then the other suite of layers of maps that we have available are what we call the spring indices. And an index is basically like a unitless number that kind of integrates a bunch of different things. So if you can think of like the S&P index or a body mass index, it's a value that tells you kind of where you're at. And so the spring indices are intended to be a metric that represents the biological start of spring. So it's not, it's kind of representative of the whole community instead of one individual species. And so what these maps yield, the values in the pixels of these maps, are the day of year that that index was met. And so how you would read this map is that we met the conditions for the spring index, again in southern Arizona and all of the southern states in this past year. You can ignore the day of year because it's just the 2016 map. We met those conditions very early, January and February, and we reached spring more on a normal time in the upper states and more like May and April. But again, like the other suite of maps, probably the anomaly information is the most meaningful. And so we offer up anomaly maps too. And what this tells you is, okay, well, was that start of spring early, late, or right on schedule? And so for this past year, in 2016, huge swaths of the country were way ahead of schedule, were weeks ahead of schedule. And just little small areas were behind schedule. This interesting stripe down in the kind of the Appalachian area, and then some of the Rockies too. Oddly enough, we were right on track in where I live this past year in terms of this biological start of spring. And so just to kind of wrap up, one of those spring indices have actually been used in quite a few analyses as of late, and one of the most recent that just was in the papers and was highlighted by Secretary Jewell a couple of weeks ago was that a group of scientists used those spring indices extended for over 100 years. They looked to see at over, I think it was almost 300 different National Park Service units or parks across the country. Has that biological start of spring changed over the last approximately 100 years? And what the colors mean here is if it's red or orange, that means that the spring, that start of spring has trended toward earlier over those 100 years. And if you see a blue color, that means it's actually gotten later. And it was a pretty clear pattern that over about 3/4 of the park units that were evaluated did show some sort of significant advancement in the timing, in the start of spring over that period. And then the red ones are ones that are now extremely early compared to the historical range of when they underwent the start of spring. And what's really kind of shocking is that those are the ones that occur, those are the parks that are found in the northernmost parts of the country. And so they're seeing the most rapid advancement in the start of spring, which definitely can have some implications for things like ice melt and migration and food availability. So to wrap up, I want to just extend an invitation to you to come check out our website. You can think about participating in Nature's Notebook and collecting observations alongside of your CoCoRaHS observations if you'd like, and if so, we have tons of resources available to support that. You're welcome to contact me and come check out any of the other resources that we have available, the phenology maps, the newsletters, curriculum materials if you're an educator. If you happen to represent a partner organization, we have relationships with hundreds of organizations. So something to meet almost every type of interest. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. Really appreciate your taking the time today to do this presentation. Very informative. And folks, if you have any questions, you want to type them in now. We'll start taking the questions. And we've got a couple already that have come in. So Teresa, I'm going to fire away here with some that have come through. And here's one here from Yuli, and Yuli says it was a fascinating talk. She has a question. It's the difference between air, ground, and water species and their change in phenology. So do any of them vary more than the others?
Oh, that's such a good question. What were the choices? Air, ground, and water?
Right, air, ground, and water.
You know, I know that there have only been a handful of studies that have been able to evaluate that, because having data on species that represent all those different systems is tough to come by. But some research by a gentleman by the name of Stephen Thackeray comes to mind. And I want to say that the paper that I'm thinking of did show significant changes among those groups. I don't know about air so much, but I'm feeling like the land-based species were showing greater advancement than the aquatic ones. But I might want to check that to be sure. So if you're interested in getting a more confident answer, I welcome you to email me and I'll look that up, because that's a great question and I don't quite remember off the top of my head.
Okay, we've got some other ones coming in here. You know, I think here, just with temperatures changing, the pine bark beetle's done an amazing job of it's not getting cold enough at night, and that's devastated a lot of stuff here in the Rocky Mountain area. We've seen those guys come through.
Yeah, they're really having major impacts there, for sure.
Okay, here's one from Shepard. He wants to know, can you tell us an American example of tropheric levels becoming mismatched over time, similar to the European example?
Oh, probably, if I thought really hard.
Okay.
I have to be honest, I just had that slide. I just love that story. It's so nice and neat. I hate to punt, but again, I would be happy to give it a little more thought and follow up. Is the best way to do that through the email like you suggested,
Yep.
Henry? Okay.
We'll give you guys, we'll give you these emails, and then you can answer the questions and follow up with that.
Sure. Yeah. I wish I had that right on the top of my head.
Okay. Here's one from Deborah, and she's wondering, can people affect the migration of birds and change seasons by putting out poisons to kill insects on plants that the birds migrate to eat? So, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know
I
either.
feel like I'm like 0 for 3 here.
Okay, one more.
I don't know. I could definitely suggest some folks that may have better awareness of that, but I'm not a bird researcher, so that's a really good, interesting question.
Well, I do have another bird question, so hopefully we won't make you 0 for 4. We'll try this one. Mary wants to know that regarding the red-eyed Vireo migration tied to temperature, is migration tied to the temperature of the Vireo's winter home or where it's migrating to?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. I am going to have to read that paper. That one's right at my fingertips, so I can pull that up and get back to the group.
No problem. Okay, and then here's one here. Ray was wondering, is the data reviewed before it shows up on the maps? I guess as far as I submit something and make a mistake.
That's a really good question. We have a whole bunch of different quality assurance, quality control things in place, but we don't, for the most part, filter out folks' reports. Actually, we don't at all. We have different ways to flag them if they look like they may be oddball. Like we're working on one where if a species is registered but it seems like it's way out of the range of where it would be expected, then it will have a flag. However, it's true that you can grow something way out of where it normally occurs if you're, persistent enough about making sure it has enough water or whatever. That said, we really do, to a large extent, we defer to the reporter and believe them in terms of what they've identified as their species that they've registered, as well as what they're observing and reporting. That said, though, if you feel like you have made a mistake, it's very easy to go back in and change it. And then once you do, as soon as you submit a record, then it's recorded in the database. And then if you change it, I don't know if it's overwritten or if it's updated, and that there's a record of it being updated. I think it's the latter, actually. So it's always traceable. But from your end, in terms of what you see, it would look like it was overwritten, and you'd therefore be adapting it and making it correct. But I think that as soon as data are submitted, I think that you can view them online or download them by the next day. I think everything that comes in one day gets, whatever happens overnight, magical things on the database side, locks it in, and then it's available the next day. So if you recognize that you made a mistake 5 days later, it's true that anybody who accessed that data in that intervening period from when you submitted it and when you changed it, they could have seen it and used it as the incorrect record. That's just the reality.
Okay, here's one from Kathy. She said she's aware of studies indicating bird migration that is affected by building lights at night, though she can't recall the names of researchers at the moment. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I've heard of that too. That's a real thing, that they're getting thrown off course by artificial light. I think even some of the migratory insects have been documented to be affected by that. And I think it's certain wavelengths. I think what I've heard is that the blue light that is now becoming more prominent in all of the LEDs and the newer technologies for light bulbs and car lights and that sort of thing is having a greater impact than the incandescent light bulbs did, which have more of the red wavelengths present in them. So yeah, I guess that's probably about as much as I can say about that. Although, if I can say something interesting, I remember studies too where plants get thrown off sometimes by that. Like I remember hearing about greenhouse plants some plants require what are called short days, which means they need a longer period of dark than light in order to undergo their changes. And if cars were driving past at night and the headlights were hitting the greenhouse, then that was basically kind of resetting their internal clock and making them think that there weren't enough hours of dark, and so they weren't flowering. So yeah, plants and animals are very attuned to that kind of stuff, way more than I think we really understand.
Yeah, Gail wrote in and she says she knows that sea turtles have that problem with lights. She's noted that before.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That sounds familiar.
Here's one from Pardee. He's a retired elementary school teacher. He used a website called Journey North or Journey South to teach kids about phenology. Are you familiar with that and thoughts about that?
Yeah, Journey North is a great program. I think the focus there is mainly on monarchs, but you can correct me if I'm wrong about that. We do have kind of a, not a very, like, how should I say this? We have a relationship with them in that we also are tracking monarchs, although we're tracking a different aspect of monarchs. I think Journey North is primarily focused on the migration patterns, and we are kind of contributing to the understanding of monarchs because there are certain things that are really well understood and then a whole lot of things that are not well understood. One of the things that is lesser well known is what species of plants do the adults nectar on while they're migrating. And I don't know if you all know, but the Fish and Wildlife Service is dealing with deciding on whether to document or list the monarchs as endangered right now. They're undergoing their species status assessment, and I think they have to make a decision within the next about year and a half. And so we're helping try to fit that one piece of the puzzle in there with better documenting what species folks are seeing them nectaring on as they're migrating. And then I know Journey North is also contributing to that effort through the migration information. And then there are quite a few other programs too that are contributing different pieces to the puzzle too. But yeah, it's a great program and definitely really appropriate for kiddos too. Ours is a little trickier for kids. I'll just be upfront with that because we're so interested in getting fairly detailed, rigorous data. The protocols, as you saw really briefly earlier on, can be kind of demanding. So, however, that said, CoCoRaHS has been lovely enough to advertise for us for many years, and it's been neat. I've been able to kind of qualitatively track who has come from CoCoRaHS, and I have to give you all props because some of the folks that come to us and participate in Nature's Notebook that have been CoCoRaHS participants prior to that are our best observers. And I think it's because you guys get the value of repeated observations and the importance of submitting the data and the importance of following protocols carefully. And so I'm so delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you all.
Well, thank you. There we go. A crowd in the background cheering that on. Hey, okay, we got a couple more. We've got a few minutes left, and the ones we don't answer, we're going to ask Teresa if she would follow up with you offline. Sure. And so here's one that Julia is wondering about. How is the El Nino or La Nina factored into the trends observed, and is it the effect of this oscillation skewing future predictions at all?
Oh, good question. Good question. Well, in a lot of cases, we haven't been able to go that deep to tease that apart simply because the density of data isn't that great. It sounds like a lot when we say we have 8.6 million records, but when you start looking at individual species and you begin to focus on just leaf out or just flowering or just migration, the amount of data that you have to analyze diminishes dramatically, unfortunately. And in a lot of cases, there are only sufficient data to establish on basic trends. However, I think in a lot of cases, what we see is that year-to-year fluctuation, like we saw with the red-eyed Vireo example that I couldn't explain very well. And in a lot of cases, I think you can kind of guess at the fact that you see that clear year-to-year variation is probably a result of oscillations, large-scale oscillations like that. And so in some cases, the researchers have dug into that further, especially ones that are working with the spring indices, those synthetic variables. to show that the timing of spring really varies dramatically from one region to the next, depending on if the PDO is in its positive phase or negative phase, or if it's an El Nino year or not. But it's been trickier to tease those patterns out from the phenology data themselves, simply because we're still working on getting enough.
Okay, Mary lives in Ennis, Texas, and she has pecan trees on her property, and she was wondering that can too much rain cause a pecan tree not to fruit? Last year they did not produce many pecan nuts, and they had above average rainfall at that time.
Huh, I don't know. Yet another one, I really don't know. That's a good question. I feel like I have heard, but I am definitely talking outside of my area of expertise, that certain fruit trees and nut trees like that can have boom and bust years. And so that must be tied, you know, certain years where they go crazy bonkers and produce tons of fruit, and other years that they basically sit idle. And that must be tied to certain conditions, but I don't know specifically for pecan. But I can say that we've got researchers here at the U of A that are deeply steeped in studying what drives pecan phenology, or pecans in general, and production. And so I can get the answer to that one for you, just not right now.
Okay, great. Maybe the pecans are more moist when you eat them, or something like that. I'm joking. Okay, let's.
I don't know.
Let's move along here. We might be able. We got 2 questions left. Let's see if we can try to get those in before we finish for today. How do you control date trend data for other variables with citizens or observers? Example: urban, suburban heat islands, which cause many degrees of temperature versus rural.
Yeah. That's a very astute question. You know, it's up to the individual researcher to decide if they're going to include those variables as potentially explanatory variables in their analytical approaches. But that said, I think that the community of folks that analyze these data are fairly aware of those kinds of potential influences, as well as elevation, latitude, some of the kind of synthetic variables like ecoregion, or which synthesizes landform and precipitation and temperature variables. Because yeah, you're right, things like an urban heat island can really skew things and show that plants are advancing, and you may attribute that to global warming, where it may actually be, well, because I'm in the middle of Phoenix and it's 10 degrees hotter in the middle of Phoenix than it is out in the rest of the sticks here in Arizona. So in our office, we don't really undertake a lot of the actual fundamental research. Our job is mainly to curate the data and make it available for others to use. So I guess I have to say, you know, it's basically up to a scientist to make sure that they're making good decisions and doing what they need to do to keep that stuff in mind.
Okay, here's our last question of the day. It comes from Tommy in Virginia, and he's noticed that the fall colors there are about 3 weeks behind this year. Have you seen, has that been a trend in the East, or have you noticed that any reports like that in Virginia? I know our trees here are probably about a week or 2 behind as far as the leaves coming off them. Any comments on that?
I've heard that. You know, that's something that you could pretty readily see in our data if you were to go in and poke around in the visualization tool, which it's a pretty fun thing to be able to do. I would basically pick a overstory canopy tree that's dominant there and pick the sites in that region and compare what are we seeing in terms of leaf color change and leaf drop for this year compared to previous years. I haven't done that, so I can't say with confidence that we're seeing those reports in our database, but I would assume that we are, because I've anecdotally definitely heard that from folks that I've talked to. I don't personally have any eyewitnesses on that because I haven't traveled in that area lately. I can only say that it's been hot here too, and things are late here too. So, but yeah, it'd be interesting to poke in there, and if you want, I could do that really quick and take a screen capture and include that in the response that I provide to this.
That'd be great. So I'm going to give you an easy softball question here as we end
Finally.
today. And this is one, this is kind of a personal preference one, but you mentioned you like hot peppers earlier on. And so what is the hottest pepper you've eaten, and what is your favorite?
You know what? I like hot stuff, but I think I'm probably a wimp. I don't know. Maybe Serrano.
Have you
we
tried the Bucciolokia ghost pepper at all?
No, 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 no,
Oh,
no. Gosh, no. No, no, it's more just because since I live here in the Southwest and we have really good Mexican food and chilies and that sort of thing, I get to enjoy that. And I really do. If it were up to me, I'd eat egg burritos every morning.
I hear you. Some great food down there. I remember when I was visiting Tucson a few years ago. Well, Teresa, thank you for taking the time out of your day. Again, this was great. We'll have this recorded. The slides will be up later this week on the website for folks if you want to go back and look at some of the stuff. And Teresa, would love for you to join Nature's Notebook if you're interested in doing that. So I'm going to sign off here, Teresa, and say thank you and appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you so much, Henry and everyone else at CoCoRaHS, and thanks to everyone who joined. I really appreciate your time. Take care.
Well, folks, mark your calendars and please join us for our next webinar. And that's coming up the first week of December. Actually, it's on December 1st, Thursday, December 1st. Chris Daly of the PRISM organization, not prison, but PRISM, P-R-I-S-M, at Oregon State University. He's going to talk about exploring the spatial patterns of climate across the United States. So don't forget to sign up for that. We'll have that available next week for you guys to sign up on the website. We'll send out some reminders. And then finally, when you sign off today, please take that survey that pops up on your screen. Only takes a minute or two, helps us out a lot. So until December 1st, this is Henry Regis for the rest of the CoCoRaHS headquarters team saying so long for now and have a great afternoon. Take care.